Dustin Rader is an English teacher in Canton, Connecticut. I think it's Avon High School, is that right? No? Canton High School. After coming out in his senior year as transgendered, he went to the University of Vermont for his bachelor's degree in English and returned to Connecticut to earn his master's degree in arts and teaching from Central Connecticut State. He has visited many of the Connecticut districts to talk about his personal experience as a transgendered, well, as a student, now as a transgender teacher. I've known Dustin for a number of years. Some of you also know Dustin's father, Bob Rader, is my counterpart in Connecticut. He's the executive director of the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education. Bob and his wife Megan are personal friends, as is Dustin. And I would like to, without further ado, introduce Dustin for that presentation. Following that, we'll have a presentation from some local folks, Cumberland and South Kingston, about their perspectives on how they are dealing with forming policies to protect the rights of transgendered students. So without further ado, Dustin.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right, let's get this started. So, as you said, I'm Dustin Rader. I'm transgender, if you haven't read it in the bio. If you haven't read it in the bio, I'm transgender. Just want to make sure we understand that. So I'm speaking from a very personal point of view. I did come out in high school, and I'm out now as a teacher. I'm out publicly. And I'm here sort of to help kids like me. That's sort of why I do this, is to help make sure that you guys know how to help kids who were like me. So I always start off with a few quick statistics. So 90% of transgender people report experiencing harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job. That's a big number, 90%. These statistics are a little bit old, but they're still pretty accurate from what I understand. And then that second statistic that's highlighted in yellow, you can see 41% reported attempting suicide compared to 1.6% of the general population. I'm not a math teacher, I teach English. But that's about 40 times the amount, which is scary to me. That's a lot of people. That's almost half of transgender people. And that's really scary. But I also want to follow that up with a good statistic. 78% of people who transitioned felt more comfortable at work despite high levels of mistreatment. So even though 90% of transgender people are experiencing harassment and 41% are going to have attempted suicide, 78%, which is a huge percentage, felt better after coming out anyways. And I think that really speaks to the fact that being transgender, it's not the being transgender that's the problem, it's the reaction of those around you. And understanding that the reaction, a negative reaction, can cause that 41%. So I want to go over some trans-related terms that you may or may not be familiar with. So MTF versus FTM. MTF is male to female. And if we can do some logic processing here, right, FTM is going to be... All right, good job. 10 points to Gryffindor. So transition is the verb. So you don't say somebody transgendered. Transgender is an adjective. And so the verb form of that is transition. And the noun form is transgender person. So I always like to clarify that because everybody's always like, oh, a transgender was here the other day. And I'm like, that's not proper English. And I know because I'm an English teacher. So that's what I'm talking about there. That's not actually a word. There are dictionaries that recognize it as a word, but they are not experts in the field of gender. And I'm not just talking about transgender, but like gender in general, as it is more than just male and female, but conversation for later. Cisgender is probably what most of you are. Cisgender is the opposite of transgender. It comes from, the cis part comes from the Latin word cis for same. I believe it's Latin, it might be Greek. I'm, again, an English teacher. So it just means same gender. You identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. Transgender versus transsexual versus transvestite. Transgender is the big umbrella term that covers everything that is not cisgender. So my identifying as transgender really doesn't give you a whole lot of information about my identity, but it lets you know I'm not cisgender. Transsexual is usually specifically for people who have gone through some sort of surgical medical transition, but it often has a negative connotation, and so not all transgender people who are also transsexual identify as transsexual. And then transvestite is people just who dress the opposite of what they are. So a man who dresses as a woman is a transvestite, but is not necessarily transgender, because you can dress as a woman if you're a man, and that doesn't make you transgender, it just makes you dressing as a woman. If you identify as transgender, then you're transgender. Intersex is a different concept, which I'm not really going to get into too much, but it's basically a different combination of chromosomes than either XX or XY. So if you have like XXY or XXX or something like that, there's a lot of different variations. Gender identity and expression. So your gender identity is how you identify yourself. So I identify as a transgender man. That's my gender identity. Everybody has one. It's not just transgender people, but everybody sitting in here has a gender identity. It's male, female, transgender female. Even, although if you want, if you're transgender, you can just identify as female. It's just an extra adjective. Expression is the way that we express our gender. So for most men, it's you wear a suit. And for most women, it's you wear a blouse or a skirt. I don't really know what women wear anymore. It's been a while for me. But the idea is we're presenting our gender at all times, no matter what we do. So even in just the way that we wear our hair, the way that we sit, you'll notice a lot of the times, at least I've noticed most of the times, women more often, let me just step away from the mic for a second, but women more often when they sit with their knees together, either ankles crossed or a tight cross across the legs. Men more often sit feet apart, probably both on the floor, and if they cross, usually like this, a little bit more loose. There's a lot of research in the background of how that happened and why that happened, but that's, again, for another day. Other trans labels, like I said, there's more than just transgender. Agender, that's somebody who does not have a gender, which is a thing. Gender nonconforming, which just means you don't really fit into male or female, you just sort of do what you want. Androgynous, which again is sort of like, is sort of you look more like both, or either. And this isn't a static list of names or terms, it's constantly changing. So pangender is all genders. And again, these are only a couple of the other trans labels that exist. There are tons of them. If you go onto a website, for example, if you go onto GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, they have a huge list of gender identities because we don't have to limit ourselves. We can identify the way we want to identify. That's what's so great about being human, is we can decide who we are, etc. So things you didn't think were offensive but are. I like to get into this because I'm certain that some of you guys are going to come up and talk to me later, and I just want to let you know beforehand, some of these things you would... I hear laughter. Some of you were already thinking these. Good. And I do this because most people don't know that these are offensive. Is anybody here familiar with the term microaggressions? Okay, a couple of people, good. For those of you who don't know what a microaggression is, it's a very small thing that's, usually it's a comment that's intended as a compliment, but what it actually does is it sets the person as other, as different. So one of the most common ones is when you meet somebody who's not native English speaker, and you say, oh, you speak English so well. And it sounds like a compliment, right? Like, oh, you did a really good job learning English, congratulations. But what it does is it highlights that person's difference, and it makes it clear that you see them as different from you. And you see it as, it must have been difficult for you to learn English. But some people have a very easy time learning English, and some people don't. And so that comes across, while intended as a nice thing, it comes across as somebody is not sure how they should identify, is not sure about how this person is similar to them. They're only noticing that difference, and that others them, other as a verb. So things that you wouldn't expect, I never would have guessed you were transgender. And yes, that's the point. You're not supposed to guess that I'm transgender because it probably doesn't matter to you. It's probably inconsequential. Most transgender people that you've met, you didn't know were transgender. That's just how it works. My mom is always saying, you know, so many people say they've never met a transgender person, but they really didn't know. You have no way of knowing unless you ask the person, and that's also a rude thing to ask. I didn't include that up there because I figured it was obvious. If you really want to come across as male or female, you should do this. I know how to be male. I do it by being myself. You do it by being yourself. There's more than one way to be a man, and there's more than one way to be a woman. I don't believe it. I've had people say that to me, and I'm just kind of like, I don't know how to explain to you how wrong you are, because I just told you. What surgeries have you had? That's between me and my doctor. What's your real name? I just told you. My name is Dusty Rader. That is my real name. It is on my birth documents. And even if it wasn't, you would happily call me that if you didn't know I was transgender. So why does it matter now? But you're so handsome. And I'm like, does that mean transgender people can't be handsome? Because, I mean, obviously, we're handsome. And then this one is usually when you first come out to somebody, you say, oh, I've known you for so long. Do I really have to learn your new name and pronouns? And usually it's intended as a joke. But what it really says is, I know you better. Even though it's not intended that way, and even though it is intended as a joke, it's not a nice joke. It seems like a nice joke, but it's not. It's, again, one of those microaggressions. So, let's talk about me now, since that's what I'm here to do, and what I like doing. I started coming out in high school, but realistically, if I think about it, I knew way before then. I knew when I was a child, I would be sitting in the car, and I would just say to my mom, I'm a boy. And my mom would say, no, you're not, you're just a tomboy. And I'd say, I don't think you're right. And she would say, I'm your mother, and I know best. And I would say, all right, that seems fair. I was a very good child. So by the time I got to high school, I was trying to be a girl. I was trying to be the daughter that my parents wanted. And what I found was that I was uncomfortable in everything feminine. So even in relationships with my friends, I didn't feel like I was one of the girlfriends. I just felt like I was a guy with a lot of girlfriends. And it wasn't something I could articulate until I went to this conference at UConn called True Colors. Anybody ever heard of that? It's a really great conference. I highly recommend it. It has professional stuff as well as youth stuff. But I went to a conference, to a workshop called Trans 101. And I had no idea what trans was. And all of a sudden, I'm hearing these things, and I'm like, that sounds like me. And I realized as I'm sitting there, like, oh my God, there's a word. There's a word for what I've been feeling for years. Right? There's a word to explain this confusion that I've had, this frustration that I've had. And as an English teacher, I just have to tell you, words are one of the most important things that we have as people, as humans. And to have a word to identify with, I mean, I know we all talk about getting rid of labels, but it felt good. I finally had a label that I could tell people and have them understand. And I could explain it. And so I immediately told all my friends, okay, call me Leo for the rest of the day. I wanted to be a boy, and I really liked Titanic, so I said Leo. And they said, okay. And they called me Leo for the rest of the day, and they used him and he and his, and it felt so right. And so about 8 months later, I kept thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. And finally, 8 months later, I came out at school very publicly. It was Cultural Diversity Day at the high school, and the GSA was doing a panel on coming out. And I decided that for my portion of the panel, I was going to come out, give everybody a coming out experience, so to speak. And I was terrified. And I have very little memory of what actually happened because I sort of was so pumped on adrenaline that I kind of blacked out a little bit, if that ever happened to you. And what I hear is that people were very respectful, and the main reaction was either secondhand pride or admiration. And that was a really important experience for me because it sort of taught me that coming out can be a really good thing. It can be a really wonderful moment, not just for the person coming out, who it's important for, but for the people receiving it. It can be a good experience. And I was terrified of telling my parents still. So I finally decided one night, I'm going to do it. All right. And I had to get myself angry. Like, literally, like, I got myself into an argument with my parents for the sole purpose of trying to avoid the possibility of backing out and not doing it. And I got so angry, and I yelled it at them, and I said, I'm transgender. I'm a boy. And they were like, okay, why are you yelling that? And I was like, because I have to? And they said, okay, but you're still you, and we love you. Is that why you got angry? And I said, well, yeah, I didn't think you guys would be okay with it. And they said, well, you really don't have to yell at us to tell us things. And that was a really important moment for me too, because it was my parents understanding sort of that I just had gotten angry to tell them this, and that meant a lot to them. Because it meant that they knew that I wanted to tell them, and that I was going to do it no matter what, and they appreciated that. And they immediately said, okay, we'll do that, that's fine. And they've been helping me ever since. My dad, who we mentioned earlier, he works with school boards, and he's been doing this ever since I came out in high school, basically, or ever since I went to college. He's been working with other school boards across the country to help transgender kids like me. And I got really lucky. My high school was very accepting. So immediately, I was given access to whatever I needed. They just said, whatever you need, you got it. And I was like, awesome. I was still afraid of using the bathrooms, so I didn't for the whole school day. And when I stayed there till 10 o'clock at night for theater, and it sucked. So that's why bathrooms are important, because quite frankly, I'm still scared to use public bathrooms. We announced earlier where the bathrooms were, and I immediately tuned out because I was like, well, I'm not using those, they're public restrooms. Even though I know that this is an accepting area, I'm still paranoid of the possibilities. And it's that paranoia that drives that 41% that I had earlier, because you're either being harassed or you know you're going to be. And it's that constant anxiety that does that. When I went to college, part of the reason I chose University of Vermont is because they had, in most buildings, gender-neutral bathrooms, which was huge at the time. It was 2009, and I was like, gender-neutral bathrooms? I don't have to pick a bathroom? I don't have to go into a men's room and feel uncomfortable? And I chose it for that reason and for another reason. It also had a program where you could choose your preferred name and your preferred pronouns. So if somebody's name is Alexander, they can change it so that the preferred name is just Alex. And that's all that the teachers would see. And then everybody picks their pronoun. And that's what the teachers see too. So there's no awkward coming out. There's no awkward, yeah, I know what my thing says, but it's actually this. Everybody. And so it doesn't single anybody out. And that was amazing. It was, again, really ahead of its time. And so I chose to go to University of Vermont. I had a wonderful experience there. I really didn't face any discrimination. When I went to grad school and to become a teacher, I did. I'm not going to get into the whole story because it takes me a long time to tell, because there's a lot of details. But basically what happened is during my student teaching, students found my Facebook page. Facebook repeatedly changes its privacy settings, and I had missed an update, and students somehow found my Facebook profile, and it mentioned that I was transgender, and I didn't mind them knowing, but apparently the school did. And so a parent supposedly sent a screenshot of a post on my Facebook, and the assistant principal, because the principal was out that day, decided that I was going to go home and not come back till Monday, and only come back Monday to find out if I would be able to continue student teaching. And I'd been teaching there for about 6 months at that point. I'd been teaching since the beginning of the year, and it was February. So it clearly, to me, I had at that point proven myself as a teacher. And the fact that I was now being asked to leave because I was transgender, to me, it was very clear that that was illegal. Connecticut has, in their anti-discrimination policy, a subsection for gender identity and expression. And so I went back to my college and I told them what had happened, and they had been contacted by the school as well. And my school was like, that's discrimination and they're not allowed to do that. And I was, again, really, really lucky, because my professors immediately called the school, called the superintendent, and by the end of the day, it was fixed. I went to talk to the superintendent, and she said, we're so sorry this happened. Except she didn't say sorry, because if you say sorry and there's a lawsuit, you obviously did something because you apologized. So she said sorry without saying sorry, and I appreciated that. I understood the situation she was in. But it was really the biggest point of discrimination that I had ever faced, and it scared me. Because if that was what happened in a liberal state, what could be happening in other places? What would happen to a student at that school if they came out as trans? What would the administration do? And it was basically at that moment that I decided that I was going to be public about my being trans. I never wanted to be in the closet about it. I never wanted to lie and tell people that I was just plain old male, right? I'm a transgender man, and I'm proud of that fact. And I think I have a right to be. I think it's okay to be who I am. And that's what we are always telling kids is, you know, be who you are. That's one of our biggest messages. Find who you are and be that person. And be a good person. And that's what I was really trying to do. And so now as a teacher, I go out and I talk at places like this. I talk to school districts. I've been to Washington, D.C. for the NSBA's Equity Conference last year. I spoke there. I've spoken at a couple of other major conferences, one in Florida for New York, and a couple of other ones. And it's all about this. It's all about the students. So let's continue. Common questions that I get. When did you know you were trans? Like I said, I was pretty young. I was probably about 2 or 3. And the reason that's important is because a lot of people are also like, how young can you be and accurately know that you're transgender? If you haven't seen, there's been a lot of news stories about, you know, little children who are maybe 2 or 3 years old being like, I'm a boy. And everybody's like, but you were born a girl. And they're like, I'm still a boy. And kids really get it. And so what you want to look at there is, I only took psychology for a little bit, but if you look at Freud's psychosexual stages of development, when we're about 2 or 3 years old, that's when we start identifying with one parent or another, if you have both gendered parents. Or, in general, either you identify with your 2 dads or you identify with your 2 moms or you don't. And that is when we start having gender, at about 2 or 3 years old. So realistically, 2 or 3-year-olds really do know. I knew. I was trying to appease my parents, right, because I wanted to make them proud. But I knew who I was. I just wasn't able to express it. And so now that that's happening, I actually think it's a really beautiful thing. Parents are being like, you know what, our kid understands this, and we understand our kid, and we love our kid, and that's beautiful. When did I come out? Again, high school. What are my pronouns? Mine are he, him, his. Usually the other one is she, her, or hers. There's also they, their, and them. And I promise you, as an English teacher, it doesn't have to be plural. It can be used for singular. Because if you say, oh, somebody left their wallet, I bet they're missing it. That's one person, right? So if you, just as an example. What bathroom do I use? Usually not any, unless it's private. But generally the male. But that's also a question you shouldn't ask. How did my family react? Pretty well. What surgeries have I had? Again, we don't answer this question. We don't ask this question. Have you ever regretted your transition? No, I have not. I am going to talk about surgery for a second because I'm okay with that. At my surgery, one of the nurses says, how can you be so sure? And she said it in like an admiring way, like I'm so impressed that at 21 years old or at 20 years old you know who you are enough to have this surgery. And I just said, well, it's about as certain as you are that you're a woman. Just makes sense to take the next steps. So some policy issues. Again, my policy knowledge is mostly Connecticut because that's where I'm from, but these still apply because it's really not really about laws. It's about respect, and it's about helping kids, and it's about what's best for these transgender students. So locker rooms, what do? Usually the answer is the student can change in the locker room that aligns with their gender identity, or they can be offered a separate private area. The key word there is offered. You can't force a transgender kid to use another bathroom because that singles them out and makes them the target. So what it really becomes is everybody is offered that separate area so that if they feel uncomfortable sharing a bathroom or a locker room with a transgender person, they have the option to leave or stay. If you force the transgender kid out, you're discriminating against that kid. It's not the same, I know, but it's similar when we first integrated bathrooms. If a white person was uncomfortable with a black person in the bathroom, the black person could not be forced to leave. It was their right to use that bathroom. It's the same sort of issue. You can't single out the person. You can't discriminate against somebody. And that you don't force the other person who's uncomfortable to leave either. You just give them the other option. Bathrooms, what do? Same basic concept. Overnight field trips. This one's also a big one that I get a lot about. If you're doing an overnight field trip, most of the time you let the kids choose the room. And so you, again, would do that. Because that way, they're not going to choose somebody who's uncomfortable being in a room with them. And they get to be with people that they care about and have a good time. That's actually pretty standard on field trips, so that would be my suggestion there. When a student transitions mid-year, what do? I actually just had a student in my school come out about 2 weeks ago, and shockingly, it was okay. I say that jokingly because that's how it should be. And the kid was able to transition and come out and be respected, for the most part. And if anybody, all the teachers were made aware. There was a note that was sent out by the principal so that everybody could know, and that's what that kid chose. That particular student said, "This is how I'd like to come out, please help me." And the principal said, "Okay." And that's what should happen. That's the standard, that's the expectation. When another student says they're uncomfortable with sharing a bathroom or locker room with a transgender student, what do? I just explained, right? And then when is it acceptable to contact the parents? Now this is a big question because there are kids who are out at school who are not out at home. I was out at school for about a month before I came out at home to my parents. And my teachers were like, "What do we do if we need to contact the parent?" And I said, "You could just not." And my teacher said, "Hypothetically, if I needed to contact your parents about a grade, what would I call you?" And I said, "You could just not." And he said again, "I need to contact your parents about a grade. What am I going to call you?" And I said, "Call me by my old name." And he said, "Okay." And he respected that because that's what was expected, right? The idea is just be respectful. Ask what the student needs. As long as you're being supportive, you're doing the right thing. And a lot of people say, well, what if the parent's not supportive? What if the kid is out to the parents and they're not okay with it? What if they go to the board and say, my student should not be treated as the gender that they want to be treated as? And realistically, what our jobs are as teachers, our first and foremost job is not to teach. It isn't. That's our second job. Our first job is keeping our students safe. Before anything else, that is our job. If our students don't feel safe, they're not going to learn anyways. So that's our first job. And if you know that a student is transgender and you know their name and you know their pronouns and you choose, you make an active choice not to address them by those name and pronouns, you're creating an unsafe environment for your students and you are not doing your job. And as board members, it's the same thing. It's difficult to deal with those parents. There are some situations where what's happening is actually abuse. Like I said before, 41% of transgender people have attempted suicide in their lifetime. I was supported by everybody around me. My parents loved me, my brothers accepted me immediately, all my friends were okay with it. I went to a college that had great opportunities for transgender people, and yet I am still part of that 41%. Even when everything goes right, that 41% is there. And so if you are adding to the stress and adding to the anxiety for that student, if you are adding to their depression, you're not doing your job. And that's why I'm here, to make sure that you realize that your primary concern is not the parent, it's the student. And so realistically, again, it's all about respect. And as long as you're making sure that you do that, primarily to the student who is in your care, you're doing all right. Thank you so much. Absolutely, yeah. Actually, I think my next slide is questions. Oh, we talked about this. Questions.